Campaign 76. Tonight, the fourth session of the Republican National Convention from the Kemper Arena in Kansas City. This portion is sponsored by the people of Ford Motor Company. On behalf of Ford and Lincoln Mercury dealers, Ford wants to be your car company. And now, here is Walter Cronkite.
Good evening. Well, this is the night for which most of these 4,500 Republican delegates and alternates came here to Kansas City. The night they nominate the man to carry their banner into the fall presidential campaign. And there seems little doubt at this hour, some 2 hours before that balloting begins, that when it ends, Gerald Ford of Michigan will be that man. He won a test vote on the rules here last night, as you know. That established, by a narrow margin, his dominance of this convention. Ronald Reagan, who gave him the closest run that any incumbent president has had for his party's nomination in almost a century. Well, Ronald Reagan kept looking for delegates today, but a realist, he did not sound optimistic, and one of his aides said it's going to take the pulling of a rabbit out of a hat to do the job. And he said, I don't see many rabbit hutches around Kansas City. If it still matters, our CBS delegate poll shows at this hour for President Ford 1,175 votes when that balloting comes tonight. That's 45 more than he needs. Ronald Reagan, 1,067, and still, for some reason, undetermined at this late hour, 17 of these delegates, according to our poll. Of course, in the Reagan headquarters, all was ebullience today, and Bob Schieffer can tell us about it down there at the Ford headquarters. Bob?
Walter, I must say, in the 2 years that I've covered the Ford White House, I don't think I've ever seen people around the president as happy as they have been today. You know, this has been a long, hard campaign year for the president. He came into office an unelected president, a lot of unexpected developments over the last few months. These people are really happy with themselves now. They think they've really done something. I don't think I've ever seen them more confident. A couple of notes on what to expect tonight. You know, the president's aides have been saying that the president wanted to drop by Ronald Reagan's suite after he gets the nomination, as we now presume that he will, to talk over with Reagan, who he thinks should be on the ticket. Well, we're told now that that meeting may not take place tonight, but may take place tomorrow morning. The timing will depend on a couple of things. First, on what Reagan wants to do. They want Reagan to talk to the president when he feels comfortable. And also, they say it depends on the mood of the convention. If the mood of the convention is mean tonight, and they really don't expect that, then they think perhaps it would be best to wait until tomorrow morning for that meeting. But at any rate, all is set for a meeting between Reagan and the president after that nomination is finally settled. A very happy Ford headquarters here tonight, Walter.
And I assume that the attitude is somewhat different at the Alameda Plaza Hotel, the Ronald Reagan headquarters. Barry Seraphin is there. Barry?
Well, Walter, today was publicly, at least, business as usual for Ronald Reagan. He was going around visiting delegations, still telling them that he and Senator Schweiker were the team to beat Jimmy Carter and Walter Mondale this fall. But, of course, we also know that today, earlier, Senator Schweiker offered to get off the possible Reagan ticket, an offer that Governor Reagan declined, saying that it was a matter of principle with him. At this point, it seems to be the philosophy around here, one of watching and waiting, and what will happen will happen. Senator Schweiker, a few minutes ago, was taking a swim in the pool in the back of this hotel. It seems to me, Walter, that there isn't a lot of expectation at this point. Of course, they know the rules vote hurt them a lot last night. Governor Reagan, his members of his family, members of his staff are upstairs where they'll be watching the balloting tonight on television. They'll be waiting, still hoping, but certainly fair to say not hoping as expectantly as they did before last night's rules vote. Walter?
Barry, there are sort of physical signs here in the hall that maybe some of the enthusiasm has gone out of the Reagan cause. There are rules against any extraneous signs in the floor of this convention. They might come down later. But just a half hour or so ago, suddenly a lot of homemade and some printed signs began to appear all over the top balcony of this Kemper Arena in the Stockyards area of Kansas City, Missouri. Signs like the ones you see there. But oddly enough, none have appeared, or only one or two in this whole hall, for Ronald Reagan. Although up through last night, there has been almost a shouting match between the partisans for Reagan and Ford on the floor. Almost got a little bit out of hand from time to time, almost got a little bit ugly in some of the shouting back and forth for attention and for rooting for their cause. There are a couple of Reagan signs that have been now posted in that balcony rail, but most of the signs are for Jerry Ford. We'll see whether the management of the convention orders them down or whether they're going to stay for the demonstrations tonight. Whether the Reagan people are, in a way, giving up or not, the mood, we can find out on the floor of this convention by asking our sterling cast of floor correspondents, and we'll start with Roger Mudd. Roger?
Walter, John Sears' Calliope, which has played so many strange tunes, so many tunes that few Republicans have heard them before, is about to run out of steam. What they had hoped to show last night was a strength upon which they could build today, but the strength last night was not there. That means that even though Mississippi will come in with perhaps 14 votes for Reagan tonight, the last 40 are going to be the toughest. And the Reagan floor whips here in this section of the convention hall admit they have no floor strategy. All they've got left is last-minute persuasion. Now to Mike Wallace.
And I'm in the California delegation, and this may be the only delegation on the floor that still has some kind of hope. But it is only hope. Miracles can happen, but I doubt that they will, is the way that one person who is very close to Ronald Reagan spoke to me just about an hour ago. Miracles can happen, but I doubt they will. The Reagan move, the way the governor felt, I asked, mainly exhausted after all the months of trying. About that meeting between the president and Governor Reagan. No time has been set, as Barry Serafin said, but they do expect that one will take place sometime later on this evening after the nomination. And finally, I asked, is there one chance in 1,000 that if the job were offered, Governor Reagan would take the vice presidential bid? Not one chance in a million, came the answer. Now to Mortine.
Mike, I agree with what you suggest, that the Reagan people will be hunting up a miracle on the convention floor tonight, but most of the party and political pros on the floor realize that miracles are usually found in churches, not in convention halls. Incidentally, during the day, I didn't find any widespread bitterness or anger in the Reagan delegation. Some pockets of it, yes, but nothing widespread. After all, the Reagan Republicans know if Ronald Reagan does not appear at the top of or on the bottom of the Republican ticket, they will get Gerald Ford, and after all, Gerald Ford is a card-carrying conservative, and the party platform is a certifiably conservative document. Now to Dan Rather. Dan?
Particularly in the South, Southwest, and West, the Reagan Army is still in the field, with all the look of a defeated army about it, but still in the field, leaderless, yes, virtually leaderless throughout this convention floor for the last couple of nights, communications down. But among the Southerners and Westerners, Reaganites to the core, still spoiling for one last fight. That may be over the vice presidency. Among the delegates I've talked to in that category, they want Ronald Reagan on the ticket. Second to Gerald Ford if necessary. If they can't get Reagan, they'd like to have John Connally. If not Connally, Ann Armstrong. Walter?
John Sears, the chief Reagan strategist, knows more about, I suppose, the mood in the Reagan camp than anybody else, and he's outside the hall with Jim McManus. Jim?
Walter, we are here with John Sears just outside the Reagan command post. Mr. Sears, you've been counting all day. Are you any happier this evening than you were this morning?
Well, there's no doubt that since yesterday, it makes us a longer shot to win tonight than would have been true if we'd done better last night on the test fight. We're going to vote our votes and see how things turn out.
Well, you were counting last night on some 40 to 50 so-called Trojan horse delegates who did not materialize for Mr. Reagan. Are you counting on any of them tonight?
Well, I think with the results of last night's test vote that most of those people will remain with Mr. Ford since he looks like the winner tonight.
Well, are you saying then that it is going to be closer tonight, and how close, if you might be able to tell?
Well, we don't and can't really make any great projection on that. You know, often when you go through a test vote, a lot of people decide that they'd better vote with the winner just so that they'll be on the right side. And we don't really know what the effect of that will be tonight in terms of people's perception that perhaps Mr. Ford will be the winner.
Well, now, I've seen your men going back out onto the floor this evening. How is their morale?
Oh, our morale has always been pretty good. In fact, I think if you were inside the trailer last night, you would have heard more humor than anything else. We always have had good morale on this ball club of ours. It's a lot different than any of the other political activities I've ever been in. Many of them have had tinges in the past of great strain and personal antagonisms and things of that kind. And this thing has really been a delight from the candidate all the way down.
Thank you, Mr. Sears. Walter?
Well, everyone is giving the nomination to President Ford, except for President Ford himself, at least publicly. Earlier tonight, he warned the New York State delegation that the fight is not over yet.
Now let me say that the ball game's not over. I've seen an awful lot of good ball teams lose when they didn't play until the final whistle. We got the final part of this game, as far as this convention is concerned, this evening. Right. The contribution of the state of New York and the delegation here can be extremely significant, just as it was last night. I am absolutely confident that we will do in New York tonight as we did last night, and I hope even better. But when we're all through with the contest tonight, we have to be absolutely certain and positive that in New York, in Michigan, in the other 48 states, that we leave that convention as a party unified for the philosophy, for the point of view, for what we believe so deeply, and if we do, we can win that election on November 2nd. Let me say, as the nominee, I will maximize my effort. I will do everything possible to make sure that we march arm in arm, shoulder in shoulder for the next 75 days, so victory is assured for the American people.
Ford victory at this Republican convention just hours away. It is assumed by almost everyone, even if President Ford is keeping the defenses up. Bruce Morton has been covering the proceedings from the podium. He can tell us what we can expect tonight. Bruce?
Walter, we've learned down here a little about the shape of the victory mechanism, I guess, how the balloting is going to go. They'll call the roll of the states alphabetically, as they always do. Alabama will yield to Nevada. It's the first state in the alphabet. Alaska, the second state, will yield to Michigan. They go on through the whole order, though. Then Nevada gets first crack, so that its Senator Paul Laxalt, who's the Reagan campaign chairman, will nominate Governor Reagan, and he'll be nominated first. William Milliken, the governor of Michigan, will nominate President Ford second. That's all the nominees there are, unless there's a great surprise nobody knows about. The nominating speeches are supposed to take 15 minutes. The convention managers are confident they'll be able to keep to that limit. The demonstrations are supposed to take 15 minutes apiece. The convention managers are not at all confident they'll be able to hold those down. Walter?
Bruce, of course, it is possible under the rules for any one of these delegates to vote for anyone he pleases. This business of having to put a name into nomination is just a formality. And, of course, there was at one time a suggestion that a Reagan strategy might be to have some votes cast for more liberal, moderate members of the party and try to drag some Ford votes out that way. But we've heard absolutely nothing of that strategy over the last week or so, and I suppose that's a dead issue, isn't it?
No, Walter, I think it's cut and dried. It's two nominees and one winner, and everybody on this podium, at any rate, is confident who the winner will be.
Right, Bruce. The Republican National Convention coverage by CBS News will continue after this message. But now the big question seems to be, who will President Ford name as his running mate? Ronald Reagan has been mentioned as a unity candidate in that post, but Reagan himself and those who are closest to him insist that he would not accept a bid, even if urged by President Ford, and there's no real indication that he is going to be so urged. The list seems to, in most people's minds, although without any confirmation whatsoever from President Ford, narrowed down. The greatest speculation is now with Senator Howard Baker of Tennessee, with William Ruckelshaus, who was a deputy attorney general, was one of the Republican heroes of the Watergate affair, and Bill Scranton, the United Nations ambassador, and one time the liberal moderate leader of the Republican Party for a brief time there when he did battle with Goldwater for the nomination in 1964. The question is getting down to that vice presidential choice, and Roger Mudd is with the Ford floor leader, Representative Bob Michael.
Mr. Michael, first, have you gotten any even private word about the vice presidency?
No, I have not, Roger.
Have you gotten any word about who it isn't?
No, I have not.
Have you gotten any word about who would be the most acceptable?
Have not.
All right, now let me ask you what you think. Knowing the delegates on the floor, the mood of the Republicans, knowing what splits there are and geographical stresses, who do you think would be the most...
Well, my personal feeling is that with an incumbent president like Gerald Ford, that the emphasis is really going to be placed there. And frankly, I find myself comfortable with most any of the names that have been mentioned. I do think, however, in view of it being a two-man race, that the president is obliged with some gesture toward Governor Reagan. Of course, he makes the point that under no circumstances would he accept. And I know that that would be acceptable with me. Now, there'll be others in the party, obviously, who'd like to see another candidate, and I'm willing to go with anyone because my emphasis is going to be on the presidency.
I'm not talking about what you yourself would be with, but what you think the delegates would like most and how it will contribute to unity.
If you take this group here, obviously, those that aren't for Ford are for Reagan, and so I suppose that most of those would prefer Governor Reagan.
But beyond Reagan, now, if Reagan says no, what's left? Elliot Richardson?
I think there's a variety of possibilities, and I wouldn't discount Ann Armstrong as a woman, one who, in my opinion, is very capable, not simply an ambassador to Great Britain, but one who I've known all through the Nixon years as one who was in the office of the president for about 8 years, frankly, with good schooling and experience, and I would feel comfortable with a woman the first time.
Okay, Mr. Michael, thank you. Walter?
Mike Wallace is with Senator Charles Percy of Illinois. Mike?
And as you know, Walter, Charles Percy of Illinois is one of the lonely liberals in the Republican Party. I say lonely liberals, although he wasn't so lonely today because his own delegation here in Illinois endorsed him for the vice presidency. Senator Percy, for a moment, you're Gerald Ford. You're President of the United States. You're going to be renominated tonight. You've got to choose a fellow, unify the party, and beat Jimmy Carter. What's on your mind? How do you think? Who do you choose?
Well, I think the first thing, the President will honor his suggestion that he will talk to Ronald Reagan. Secondly, I hope he goes with him with a firm decision and convinces Ronald Reagan that the decision is right. Certainly, he should reach out and broaden the base. He has to have someone who will appeal to pull over independents and Democrats and still hold all the Republicans. That's the kind of a candidate he needs.
Okay, so he doesn't offer it to Ronald Reagan.
That's right.
What do you think?
And I accept Ronald Reagan's decision not to run.
All right.
He told us that yesterday very convincingly.
Now, 3 names are up now. We understand. William Scranton, Ruckelshaus, Howard Baker.
I would say that Governor Scranton is an outstanding choice. He was certainly one of those I listed. Howard Baker was one of the 5 names I listed. Ruckelshaus would have been a brilliant choice for Ronald Reagan. And I think all 3 of them are good choices. They have demonstrated their ability to have confidence in Democrats as well as independents, and that's what's necessary to win in November.
So you think that any one of those 3 is a good man? Any one of the 3?
Well, I've worked with all 3 of them, and I think they're outstanding.
All right. Walter?
One name on some of the list is Governor Dan Evans of Washington State. Mort Dean's with him. Mort?
Walter, Mike Wallace talked about lonely liberals. I think Governor Evans prefers to be known as a lonely moderate rather than a lonely liberal. Governor, have you heard anything from the White House about your possible candidacy for Vice President?
Nothing specific, and I think the President is absolutely honest when he says he still hasn't made up his mind, still hasn't finalized his choice.
Now, this morning you met here in Kansas City with that small band of Republican governors, and you were tossing around vice presidential possibilities. What names came up as favorites of the governors?
Well, this was a meeting where the President wanted to do two things, I think. First, thank the governors for their support, because he has had overwhelming support from the Republican governors, and then ask their advice on both the vice presidential and campaign techniques.
Okay.
We covered just about everybody, I guess.
You covered just about everybody. What
Everybody
advice?
who's been, reasonably mentioned. If I could capsulize it all, I would say that the governors unanimously indicated to the President that they had confidence in him, that they knew he had a variety of elements that would go into his decision-making, that they would be satisfied and enthusiastic with whatever decision he made.
Did the President offer names for you to consider, or was it the other way around?
No, it was the other way around, really. He said, what do you think? There were some some statements by 2 or 3 governors indicating that they would, of course, prefer as first choice one of 2 Republican governors, myself or Governor Ray, but they understood that it would be a little difficult to talk about that while we were all there.
And you, in a word, are interested?
Well, I've got mixed feelings, frankly. I would do anything the President asked me to do in order to help his reelection.
Thank you very
That's the
much.
best way to put it.
Governor Dan Evans of Washington. Walter?
Dan Ruthers with Bill McLaughlin of Michigan. He's a Ford floor leader, and he's assistant to the floor manager for President Ford, Senator Robert Griffin. Dan?
Walter, this is the kind of person who put it together on this convention floor for Gerald Ford. He's been a long-time Republican down-of-the-trench worker in the state of Michigan. Bill McLaughlin, first of all, who would run best as a vice presidential running mate for President Ford in Michigan?
Well, Dan, we think someone in the middle spectrum of the party, moderate, would do very well. We'd love Nelson Rockefeller. Probably recognize he won't be. I think a Howard Baker, a Bill Ruckelshaus, someone of that mold would be an excellent running mate for Jerry Ford.
Now, that's what you'd like to have in the Michigan, Illinois, Ohio sort of section of the country. But straight talk, what kind of candidate do you think you're going to get?
I think the Howard Baker, Bill Ruckelshaus thing, we think is going to be the best candidate that's going to come out of this.
Do you think the president is far enough behind in the polls that he's going to have to take a high-risk second choice, such as, for example, Ann Armstrong?
No, I don't. I think the polls will close up dramatically after this convention is over. I think that the president can afford to take a candidate who is going to be a good vice president, a good running mate, and who will help get him votes and will please both ends of the party.
You don't think you would take Ronald Reagan or John Connally?
I have no idea what he's going to do. I'm not sure that he's made up his mind yet.
Walter? Roger Mudd is with Ford strategist F. Clifton White. Roger?
Mr. White doesn't know what to call himself. We'll call him the chief headhunter on the floor for President Ford. Mr. White, the question is, which of all the nominees, possible vice presidential nominees, would give President Ford the best chance of beating Carter?
Well, I think probably almost any on that total long list that you've got.
Come on now. You can't have 15. They're all not equal, are they?
Well, they'll all be in there working for us, and
Sure.
I think a large number of them have adequate qualifications to be considered, which is what the president's doing.
But given the Carter candidacy and the geographical stresses and the president's weaknesses, one of them has got to give the president
No,
more.
I think as a result of your media, we run a good deal more national campaigns than we used to, rather than this regional and geographical fixation, because these people are all perceived essentially for office through your medium, and therefore it's a national candidacy for all 50 states.
Have you talked to the president about a vice presidential
No, I have not yet.
Who's talking to him about it?
Oh, he's meeting with a large number of people. He had all the Republican governors in this morning to consult with them, and he's been consulting with various other groups.
Who do the governors like? Who do the governors?
I don't know. I have not seen the president since that meeting.
And you don't have any inkling of who it's going to be?
Sir.
Okay.
No, sir.
All right, Mr. White. Thank you.
Incidentally, there were 2 governors missing at that meeting this morning, Governor Meldrum Thompson of New Hampshire and Governor Edwards of South Carolina. Neither one of them supported President Ford. Thompson is not a delegate. Edwards was the only delegate governor who was in the Reagan camp. They were not at the meeting this morning, which was not, therefore, a unity meeting by President Ford, but an attempt to solicit some opinions on this vice presidential choice that he now faces. Unity is another problem that faces President Ford. We'll be talking about that as we go along. By the way, this is likely to be a very noisy session of this Republican convention. I've been watching the delegates coming into the hall, and a lot of them are carrying long horns that they have obtained somewhere, although those are supposed to be banned, but so are these private signs that have blossomed all over this Kemper Arena. We'll be back in 1 minute with more CBS News coverage of the Republican National Convention. We told you about those horns being brought into the hall, and even as we did, Lee Bowman, who's the master of ceremonies and starts each session before the gavel came down. He is the old actor who now has an actor's school out in Hollywood. Well, he asked them to stop blowing the horns, these delegates, and then called them idiots. Said those who are blowing the horns must be idiots. Kind of strong words by master of ceremony. He did say it with something of a smile. The big problem for President Ford, besides naming his vice presidential running mate now, is to bring unity back to this party. And he expects to meet with Ronald Reagan, either late tonight or tomorrow morning. We now hear it may be tomorrow morning to begin that effort to patch together a party badly divided over the tough campaign that Ronald Reagan waged beginning last year and right up until last night, well, I guess you can technically say up to tonight, for the presidential nomination, trying to deny an incumbent president of his own party the nomination. That would be the first time it has happened since 1884. CBS News coverage of the Republican National Convention will continue in a moment.
CBS News continues its special report. CBS News continues its special report, Campaign 76. Tonight, the fourth session of the Republican National Convention from the Kemper Arena in Kansas City. This portion is sponsored by S-Mart, 35th largest U.S. corporation.
Incredibly, again tonight, the Republican National Convention session opens on time. This is the color presentation, the color guard from the University of Kansas ROTC unit.
Tonight we will be led in the Pledge of Allegiance by one of our national heroes who has been awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor, 2 Silver Stars, and other awards for valor. A prisoner of war in Vietnam from 1967 to 1973, presently the chairman of the South Dakota Republican State Central Committee, Air Force Colonel Leo K. Thorsness.
Congressman Rhodes, ladies and gentlemen, having lived under communism and other forms of government for several years, I can guarantee each of you here tonight that yet tonight there is still no other nation in the entire world that even approaches the greatness of our two-party republic. And I hope each of us realizes the opportunity we have here in Kansas City this week to strengthen or weaken that two-party republic. Ladies and gentlemen, would you join me in the sincere pledge to the finest nation in the world? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you.
Leo Thorsness ran against Senator George McGovern for the Senate in 1974, but he was defeated by McGovern 53 to 47%. National anthem being sung by Gloria Loring, who toured with Bob Hope in Vietnam.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the
The invocation will be offered. The invocation will be offered by the Reverend James O. Leffingwell, Executive Secretary of the Intercity Church Agency of Kansas City, Missouri.
Eternal Spirit, in the midst of this exciting and important evening, we pause not to express an opinion, but to seek a presence. We pray for these whose decision tonight may shape our destiny, and for those who are disenfranchised by our political and social system. We pray for our systems of law and order, and for those who suffer injustice. We pray for our complex system of business and industry, and for those who are unable to find work. We pray for our institutions of international peace and understanding, and for those who are this day subjected to the pain and death of war. We ask these things with some desperation and some hope and some faith. Amen.
And so this session of the Republican National Convention, scheduled to nominate the party standard bearer for 1976, gets underway. Eric Severide and Bill Moyers have some thoughts now on the last major question to be decided here, apparently, since it does appear that President Ford will win that nominating battle tonight, and that's the question of a vice presidential selection. Gentlemen?
Well, if one makes the assumption that there will be no overpowering movement on the floor to draft Mr. Reagan for vice president, then Mr. Ford has to be thinking, I would think, at three different levels, Bill. He's got to think about party unity, this immediate problem, when he makes that choice. He's got to think about which man would do him the most good in November, or at least the least harm, and that's probably the more realistic way to assess it. And three, who could make a respectable, competent president of this country if something happened to President Ford himself? Party unity. How should he go, do you think?
Well, it'll take some rather ingenious contortions to try to work around those three predicaments. As a partisan, Eric, he has to recognize that 1/3 or more of the Reagan delegates in this hall have told CBS and other pollsters that they will not vote for Gerald Ford if Ronald Reagan is not nominated here tonight. Ford cannot take that threat lightly. Now, there's always a chance that the prodigals will come home unless he pulls the welcome mat out from him, from under them. So the president cannot pick a liberal who will enrage them.
So he can't have a rebellion here.
He cannot, nor a sit-down in November. These are resolute delegates and Republicans. They're zealous. They do the work in the trenches in November that usually pays off for the Republicans when it does pay off. He cannot enrage them with a liberal. But as a president, he's got also to think about the fact he can't just get by with them.
I wonder how many would vote for Carter or not vote. After all, the breach has widened with the Democrats. The Carter speech and platform is now strict New Deal, Fair Deal, Great Society. They have a very conservative program here. Who else are conservatives going to vote for?
Well, they might not vote. That's the big thing that he has to work out.
The second question, who would do him the most good or the least harm at the election? In terms simply of votes. I assume that maybe they've got to write the South, or most of it, just write it off to Carter. And they've got to look for somebody, a border state person, Midwest person, moderately liberal Republican. They have some appeal in both directions geographically. Wouldn't you think so?
You certainly, in politics, don't play to your opponent's strength. And Jimmy Carter is very strong in the South because George Wallace has now endorsed him. The old Southern strategy won't work. Gerald Ford's basic strength is in the Midwest and in the Northeast among the Republican Party, as attested to by the fact that so many Northeastern delegates have been formed. In fact, Ronald Reagan didn't win a single primary in the eastern states. So he's got to go to that area. If you drew a map, a line down from Chicago to the Mason-Dixon line and then took it toward the Atlantic, you go into that heavily Catholic, heavily neighborhood-oriented, heavily working-class part of America that is still slightly suspicious of this interloper from Georgia, Jimmy Carter. Seems to me Gerald Ford has to aim his arrows right there.
Would that mean, you think, someone like Baker or Ruckelshaus, Indiana, Baker's Tennessee, both are moderates? Baker, of course, much better known to this convention, these delegates, than Ruckelshaus is. But there are a lot of reasons why some of the people around the president like the idea of Ruckelshaus. He's Catholic, for one thing. He's young, he's strong, he's a good campaigner, he's fresh, he's a Mr. Clean. And then there's that third question of, and I assume in the interest of all of us, they're thinking about it, who could make a good president if something happened to the sitting president?
I think very few nominees have ever neglected that question. They try this contortion act, but they don't neglect that question. When they do, they get in trouble, as Richard Nixon got into trouble with Spiro Agnew back in 1968, 1972. It's got to be someone, it seems to me, who can start building this Republican Party again. This party is if it's not dead, it is certainly ailing. You look at the facts. In Congress, 1/3 of the Senate are Republicans. Democrats outnumber Republicans 2-1 in the House. Republicans control only 13 of the 50 state houses, and Democrats control both houses of the state legislatures in 37 states. You've got to have a warrior in there who can help you build for the future.
If he were going to go on the basis of experience and ability, so on, I suppose you'd want a Rockefeller, but he's poison to this party in the Assembly. I don't think he would even consider it himself. Scranton's had quite a bit of experience. Baker, I don't know. I get that impression from White House people that they think that Ruckelshaus is a man of a more powerful intellect and force of will than Senator Baker.
Both Baker and Ruckelshaus help him get over the Watergate issue, don't they?
And maybe somebody we haven't even mentioned may come up before this is over. Thank you, Bill Moyers. Back to Walter Cronkite next.
Bill and Eric, we've been talking about the problems that Ford has getting the right side of his party unified for the coming campaign, but he's also got some problems from the left. Connecticut Senator Lowell Weicker, who did not attend this convention, you know, is running for re-election to the Senate, and he has said today that he will not run on the platform adopted here in Kemper Arena. And as a matter of fact, he advised Jerry Ford, he said, if I were Jerry Ford, I'd turn to the Republican Party at this stage of the game and say, take it, it's yours. So the problems are on both ends of the spectrum.
That's right.
Thank you, gentlemen. This session of the convention, as we have been saying, of course, is the one for which most of these delegates came to Kansas City. This is the one that nominates the presidential candidate of the party. And as we know from last night's test vote on rules, President Ford seems to be in command by a fair margin of votes, but certainly nothing overwhelming. Not so many that couldn't be overturned if the Reagan forces could find something to overturn it with, but they apparently haven't come up with that. And it looks like the margin is going to be around 100 votes or so at this stage of the game. Our CBS News delegate poll shows that President Ford now has 1,178 votes he can count on tonight. Ronald Reagan, 1,067. That's the measure of the margin. Undetermined still at this hour, some 14 votes. Tonight, the procedure will be, as we get toward the balloting, that will come in about an hour, the nominating speeches. In the meanwhile, there are party speeches being made. They're talking about the forthcoming campaign and all the things that politicians talk about when they get together in their quadrennial rallies, such as this one. But when they get around to the important business of the night, which is the only real business of the night, they start the roll call. Alabama is going to yield to Nevada, and very shortly Nevada then will step up. Paul Laxalt will step up. He's the senator from Nevada, and nominate Ronald Reagan. And then a little later on, they'll yield for Michigan, and Michigan's Governor Milliken will go to the podium, and he will make the nominating speech for President Ford. After the seconding speeches, and on the Ford side, they expect to have 20 such speeches, but only lasting a few seconds each, because each side will only be permitted 15 minutes for its nominating and seconding speeches. And after that, 15 minutes will be allowed demonstrating by each side before they'll try to gavel this rather raucous group of Republicans into order and get the balloting started. The security outside the hall tonight is not as tight as it has been up to now for some reason or other. Maybe Nelson Benton outside can tell us. Nelson?
Walter, one of the things that has happened is that the security rules have totally lifted the lid on a possible battle of signs between Ford and Reagan supporters tonight. As you said earlier in the broadcast, the plans were not to have extraneous banners and signs inside the hall. But what you see on the ground outside the arena is a Ford sign operation. They don't have staffs for the signs, just the signs themselves. The signs are painted sort of free form. It is not nearly as elaborate, however, as the Reagan sign operation, which is going on inside the arena and has been going on through the afternoon. The security people told us, Walter, that several tons of Reagan material were brought into this area of the arena this evening to pass out to any delegates who want to carry them on the floor. There are Reagan pictures, there are Reagan signs, there's our horns. You've probably heard some of those horns on the floor, and to each horn is attached a little pouch of confetti for Reagan delegates to use when the occasion demands that they are in pretty good shape. And also, Walter, I have with me another one of the Reagan gimmicks. It's a Reagan Frisbee. Back to you.
Republican National Convention coverage by CBS News will resume after this message. There's been a lot of talk of disappointed conservatives leaving the Republican Party this year, at least abstaining from voting in November, not lending their help to the party in the campaign to come. Part of that talk was centered around Senator Jesse Helms of North Carolina, who has been a leader of some forces that began to call themselves independent conservatives here, and were putting a lot of pressure on Reagan and on the Platform Committee and the Rules Committee to abide by suggestions they had for making the party more conservative, and they succeeded in getting some of those things through. They had strong delegations in 22 of the states. Well, there was some talk that Senator Jesse Helms might even defect and lead a lot of the people over to a third party, and there is going to be a conservative third party meeting in Chicago in a week or so. But today, Senator Helms said that is not in the cards at all as far as he is concerned. He's not interested in the third party, in any part of it. He believes in a two-party system, and he's sticking where he is. The delegates, of course, all have strong views on the vice presidential choice and who would run well in their particular sections of the country, and the South is an important area in that consideration. Ed Bradley reports from the Georgia delegation on that southern view. Ed?
Walter, I'm standing with Carl Cupers, who is a candidate for the state senate in Georgia, and he happens to be wearing one of these signs. It says, give him Helms, Jesse, Vice President. Are you serious about that?
Well, in a way, yes.
Who do you think would be the best help to you in Georgia on the number 2 spot in the ticket?
Reagan.
If he does not accept it, as he has said he would not accept it, who do you think of next?
Conley of Texas might be a pretty good man.
John Conley would help you. Now, you're from an area south of Macon. You're running for the state senate.
Right, sir.
You ran 2 years ago.
Right.
You were defeated.
Right.
That seat has never been held by a Republican.
That's
so if
correct.
there's anyone who needs some help, it's you.
Right.
Now, will Conley help you against Jimmy Carter?
He would help me some, but not as much as Reagan.
Reagan is the best candidate for you.
He's the best candidate.
Do you think he should accept it? Would you urge him? If you had an opportunity to talk with Ronald Reagan, would you urge that he accept it?
He would do better if he was a presidential nominee, but if he isn't the presidential nominee, I would urge him to take the vice presidency.
And what about a moderate candidate? Is that any help at all to you?
Not too much. Well, not too much. It's a name that counts down there.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cooper. Walter?
So the debate goes on the floor as to who would be the greatest help on the Ford ticket as his vice presidential running mate. Nelson Rockefeller, who is, of course, the present vice president, took himself out of the running some time ago, months ago, before the primaries ever began, and said that he would not be a candidate and did not wish the post again. It is believed that if Ford tried to draft him, Nelson Rockefeller might reconsider, but there's no indication that the president intends to do that when he wins this battle tonight, as he is certainly expected to do. Sylvia Chase is with the Reagan supporters now in the California delegation. Sylvia?
Walter, in answer to anyone's question about who would be the best vice presidential choice for Ford, the answer is it certainly shouldn't be Reagan. These people are not prepared to give up, not even perhaps until after the balloting is over, not even after the balloting is over tonight. And I have with me State Senator John Stull, who says that at a caucus this afternoon, the California people received a note, which I'd like you to hold up. I don't know if you can see this note, Walter. It's a personal note from Ronald Reagan. And it says here, you read it to me. It says there is, right here.
The last paragraph?
Yes.
This is from signed Ronald Reagan. There is no circumstances whatsoever under which I would accept the nomination for vice president. That is absolutely final. Now, this came about this afternoon about 5 o'clock when his brother, Neil, who is a delegate to the California delegation, brought this back where Ronald Reagan had written it in the midst of his search for delegates, and we duplicated it, and we're distributing it now throughout the delegation.
Now, look, I may sound like a cynic, but, you know, we all think that Governor Reagan has to say up until the last minute that he won't run for VP, but that he would.
Well, that, of course, was a question that was brought up in our caucus this morning. There was some question about, despite his published statements, that he wouldn't run and he wasn't interested. And, in fact, repeated.
But he won't, your answer is that he won't run.
And this was brought back as late as 5 o'clock, that there's no circumstances that he will. And I have to believe him because we think he's the greatest guy in the world.
I guess that's your answer.
Well, there's a lot of reason, of course, that we reporters are somewhat skeptical, as the public has a right to be, about denials of a man's availability for the vice presidency. Very few people run for the vice presidency, and certainly no one who is running simultaneously for the presidency ever acknowledges he'd take the second post. But it also must be said that Ronald Reagan has certainly been firm in his statements over the days, these last few days, that he is not available as a Ford running mate. Leslie Stahl is with the chairman of the New York delegation, a Ford supporter, for the view from the Northeast on this vice presidential selection. Leslie?
Walter, I'm standing here with Richard Rosenbaum, who is fast becoming known as the Kojak of the political world. Mr. Rosenbaum, what vice presidential choice do you think President Ford should pick to best help the candidates running in the Northeast?
Well, I would like to see a candidate who broadens the appeal of the party ticket so as to bring in Democrats and independents to vote for Republicans. I think that's entirely possible if we have a candidate that is a moderate, centrist-type candidate My own personal preference has been Nelson Rockefeller, but he seems to have pretty much taken himself out of the possible formulation. And so it would require, as far as I'm concerned, a candidate from any section of the country, but one that would be perceived as a moderate type.
It's true, isn't it, that in the Northeast, the only Republicans, generally speaking, who win elections are liberal Republicans?
Well, I think that it depends on the office. We have some very conservative congressmen. We have Senator Buckley, who could hardly be described as a liberal. It's not necessarily so. It really depends on the constituency, and I think to a certain extent on the personal appeal of the candidate.
What about Ronald Reagan? Would he help or hurt?
Well, I think that we could look to a candidate who might have a broader appeal than Ronald Reagan. On the other hand, he's certainly a very talented person, and I would not dismiss that possibility out of hand.
Okay, thank you very, very much. Walter?
Leslie, why do they call Mr. Rosenbaum the Kojaks of the political world?
Well, if you can see the top of his head, Walter, I think it's self-explanatory.
Oh, I just didn't get that at first. Thank you, Leslie.
Okay.